welcome to Varn Blog. And today I have Pascal Robert and Jason Myles from This Is Revolution.
Love the intro.
Robert, Varn. Pascal Robert, Varn. Get it right.
Yeah. Sorry.
You got to say Robert. Robert.
It's Haitian.
Love the intro.
Yeah, you would.
It is.
Can I say since Napoleon called me, Napoleon the Legend called me Puffy of the left. Can I say, remember that Saturday called me Puffy of the left? Can I say that song is one of my favorite songs? That was one of the first things I recorded when my last project with my ex ended. And I pretty much locked myself in my place, which is a studio, and learned how to play the drums. I taught myself how to play the drums and do some other things musically that I wasn't able to do before. So I've never been able to release that. So this is the first time it's like out. So it's always crazy hearing it.
Yeah, thanks for that. Jason donated our music and actually did our intro clip, made it all black metal-y. So
as I'm wearing the Slayer hat.
We're here to talk about and black politics since the early 60s. Starting, we're going to start out asking you about the shift that was attempted around Harold Cruse and the movement to black nationalism, black cultural nationalism, the idea that black cultural nationalism could create a coherent revolutionary subject, and how maybe that didn't work at all. This is really Pascal's specialty. And Jason, you will be on basically to tell us about the pop culture elements of this, because you're always the person who knows the movie that can be associated with the time period.
So it's funny that we're talking about this today, because kind of coincidentally, so the first video I've done for Zero, video essay I did for Zero, the next one is going to be actually an essay that Pascal wrote some time ago, probably like 3-4 years ago. Pascal, you wrote that?
2019.
Okay, 2019, about Clarence Avant, who is going to be a bit of a character today, and what we're talking about when it comes to this black political class, especially post the 60s. And we're going to be probably talking about, post the uprisings of that same era, right? The post King death uprisings. And also I think it's kind of interesting today that we're talking about this, because there is a writer that's kind of making the rounds, the social media rounds, if you will, talking about movements and policing kind of sort of in this era as well. And I think Pascal has done some good writing on this era from a pop culture standpoint, but also from analyzing black politics as a class politics. So, part of me is going to sit back and enjoy the back and forth between you two, and I'll be happy to interject when called upon.
Awesome. So I've been fascinated with Harold Cruse as a figure in this attempted shift at black nationalist, black power politics for a while. I read The Crisis of the Negro, and I still keep it around. I remember, I taught when I started teaching. Oh God, it's almost 15 years ago now. I taught at a mostly black high school because I'm from the South, and when you're in the South and you're a teacher at a public school, usually you teach at a mostly black high school, given the way the demographics are where they are, and the way that white flight works, particularly in that area. And I was also interested in of what Obama meant.
You broke up a little, Derick.
Yeah, having connectivity problems. I was teaching during the time period from the transition from Bush to Obama in a 60-40 school district. So 60, slightly majority black. Weird for Georgia though, because there was no actual private school for the white kids to run to. They were still mostly in public school. So it was a interesting time to get public opinion, and I remember turning to two things to try to get grasps on it as I was kind of breaking out of my own political shell. One is that I found Bruce Dixon, and two is I found Tim Wise. Tim Wise was not helpful. Bruce Dixon was, but I felt weird. But I felt weird as the white guy with the Black Agenda report in his head, because I'm like, I don't know if this is for me. I should probably be listening to Tavis Smiley or something. And that led me to this internal critique of Black politics that I don't think most leftists, particularly most white leftists, know any form of outside of Adolph Reed Jr. and Touré Reed. So, and I sort of start that dialogue back with the crisis of the Negro intellectual forward. Now I know there's probably a deeper history and I don't know it, but I do know about like the CPUSA's relationship to the civil rights movement, etc. And it's sort of on again, off again commitment, depending on where it was in the pop front. But there seems to have been a big shift around that time. And I find it interesting because it seems to me, Pascal, that that a lot of the people at the Black Agenda Report actually think that the move that that someone like Cruse was trying to attempt actually ended up becoming the basis for the kind of thing he was complaining about the assimilationists for. I mean, am I being unfair there, or?
I can understand why you would have that conclusion. I think that my analysis of the Harold Cruse project as a student of Black politics, I'm not a PhD or an academic, but I read what I can and I confer with those who are, is that Harold Cruse is basically what you would call a cultural nationalist. Mm-hmm. And a cultural nationalist within the context of Black political thought is one who believes that basically African-American culture and contribute to American culture has a particular essence in and of itself that is distinct and justified in being venerated. Mm-hmm. And with the Cruse project, there are various manifestations, right? Because there's also a cultural nationalism that's rooted in a kind of Afrocentric or kind of African cultural kind of adoration, if you will. But that's not the type of cultural nationalism that Cruse is particularly an adherent of. He's not an Afrocentric. He's not an African cultural fetishist by any stretch of the imagination. He's very similar to kind of Ralph Ellison in that he believes that Black Americans are Americans and that their contribution to America culturally and socially makes them part of American exceptionalism, and that they should embrace their uniquely American identity and embrace a kind of cultural exceptionalism in that. All right. Some people actually, at a period, people thought that Cruse was actually somewhat radical. There's nothing radical about Harold Cruse. He's actually very conservative in that what Cruse's project basically is trying to do is to reify American exceptionalism with a Black cultural tinge to it. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And Cruse comes out of the old left. He came out of the CPU, the Communist Party. He was an actor, or I believe he worked in the theatrical world. And he is a guy who was clearly frustrated with the integration movement in the civil rights movement. He's clearly frustrated with the way in which he believes that the white left never fully dedicated itself to the Black left, without mentioning the role of McCarthyism, without mentioning the role of the Popular Front, the United Front, and all these other factors, right? He kind of feels that Black people should have venerated their own culture, and he's kind of attacking some of what were called quote unquote integrationist movement leaders for their lack or unwillingness to venerate particularly the importance of Black culture, right?
Would you say he's close to what we would call ADOS now?
He's
like proto ADOS.
He's proto ADOS is perfect. It's very fascinating you said it, because I have a very good friend of mine, Matthew Quest, who is a academic, and we talk about ADOS, and he wrote a piece about ADOS, and he says that there are certain elements of Harold Cruse in ADOS. To give you an example of someone who was a big fan of Harold Cruse, who actually wrote, I believe, the foreword to the latest version of The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, was Stanley Crouch. Now, I had certain affection with Stanley Crouch in some ways. I know a lot of people hate him, can't stand him, but I liked the way in which Crouch was willing to ideologically deviate from normative accepted postures of what Black thought should or shouldn't be. But I do agree that his project was no doubt conservative. It was not transformative. And he was also, his project was about saying that Black culture is exceptional American culture, and that Black people are an important part of American exceptionalism. And we are an integral part of American exceptionalism. Now, you would have to understand why that particular position is contentious in the politics of the 60s, right? Because you have Malcolm X, who dies in 65, but in 64 is castigating Black people who want to be American. He's basically saying is like the fact that these people are rejecting their African identity tells you how lost they are. They just want they basically piece of Master's plantation. So he's literally castigating the notion of Black people even identifying with America or being American or taking pride in America. And he's moving to a much more Pan-African, African-centered kind of position. And Malcolm X strongly influences in 66, you have the rise of the Black Panther Party, right? And one of the things that's happening internally with the rise of the Black Panther Party eventually is that there's a major battle between two different factions of the movement at the time, which is the US movement led by Maulana Karenga, which is the guy who eventually founds Kwanzaa, and the Black Panther Party, which many people allegedly accuse Karenga of being an agent and having I think one particular member of the Black Panther
killed,
Party.
Right? He had what's his name killed? Bunchy Carter killed, right?
But not Bunchy Carter. I think it was Bobby Hunt. I forgot the actual name of it. Escapes me right now. But the point of contention between the Black Panther Party and the US movement was about the battle between cultural nationalists and revolutionary nationalists. Mm-hmm. And Huey P. Newton excoriated what he called the kind of basic simplistic African fetishism of the US movement, and he used to call them pejoratively pork chop nationalists, in that they have a culture they have a cultural fetishism with all things African without even understanding the complex sophistication of African society. And they have this ridiculous fetishized notion of Africanism divorced from any kind of understanding of political economy or class and capitalism. So there was a faction of the movement who was on the posture that if Black people got in touch with their true African essence, that they would be redeemed and cured and be able to function. And part of my main problem with cultural nationalism of any variation, whether it is the Harold Cruse variation or the US variation or the Afrocentric variation, is that it's all a posture of what I call, and I wrote a piece about this, called the politics of redemption, which is the notion that Black people need to be redeemed and prove their value to white people to be able to be accepted, that we must venerate our Black culture, we must venerate our Black American culture or our Africanness to heal ourselves because we are damaged. So cultural nationalism and of all sorts, I despise it because it is based on a concept that has existed for years, over 2 centuries in Black life, which is damage thesis or damage theory. What is damage thesis or damage theory? Damage thesis or damage theory is the notion that because of slavery, when Black people were divorced from their African cultural selves, that they became broken and unable to function, that they somehow were just ripped away from the ability to be whole, and they needed to be made heal. They needed to heal. And I mean, there are people, and Jason can attest to this. We've had people on our show talking about like Black people are broken, Black people are damaged. I know, Jason, you've heard this.
That was a great show. Well, that's what you get in the 90s, right? If you go back and look at those hood movies of the 90s, that was kind of an underlying theme of all those movies, is that this is a broken people that need hugs.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
everybody needs a hug.
Right. Right. So, the whole damage thesis, it goes back to the 19th century. If you want a good book by an academic, I'm actually connected to him on Facebook, that traces the kind of various formations of the damage thesis. There's a man by Darrell Michael Scott. He wrote a book called Contempt and Pity. And his contribution to the analysis is that basically there are 2 flanks to the damage thesis that the ruling class uses. The contempt flank, which the reactionary right uses, is that Black people are so despicable that they should be contempted because they are not human, not whatever, savages. They're culturally defective. They are horrible. They cannot be integrated in any way in society, which is the posture of the reactionary right, which is the contempt. The pity part is the liberal left faction, is that, we did these people harm, but we have to feel sorry for them and feel bad for them. We know they're inferior, but we shouldn't be so mean to them because we understand that we kind of made them that way. But we do agree that they are inferior, but we feel bad for them, and hopefully we can find some way to make them whole. So the thesis of what Scott's book is that basically that African American discourse and ruling class politics and policy, basically for over 200 years of America, has vacillated between 2 worldviews when it came to Black Americans, which is contempt or pity, both premised on the notion that Black people are damaged, broken, something is wrong with them, And what is particularly problematic is that there are significant elements of internal Black political thought that have leveraged heavily and believe and propagate the damage thesis. Black nationalism, classical. Now, there are various iterations of Black nationalism. You have the classical Black nationalism, kind of Marcus Garvey, Nation of Islam. You have revolutionary Black nationalism, which is kind of the Black Panther Party. And you have petite bourgeois Black nationalism, which is kind of like uplift the race, talented tenth. We all want people together. Come on. Now, one of the things about this gentleman, Darrell Michael Scott, is that he argues that the only way you can be a Black nationalist is if you believe that Black people need to have their own territory. I think that's a very ridiculous and reductionist posture of believing Black nationalism. If you read some of the original writing and scholarship, I do not believe that Black nationalism is premised on the belief that Black people necessarily should have their own territory. There are many Black nationalists who believe that. My particular argument is Black nationalism is based on the notion of collective corporate unity of Black people. That Black people are all one people that can be summoned together. Us as a people, we as a people, our people, we people, us, we. I think that all of that is rooted in the kind of collective notion of all one people. And what I believe, and which I learned from initially Bruce Dixon, and also reading Adolph Reed and Cedric Johnson and Tory Reed and those who come out of that Reed tradition and other people of the Black left, is that the problem with Black politics when it comes to its application is the collective unity theory, because it renders Black politics to a politics of containment. Because if you make Black people one, they're easily to be disposed of as one, as opposed to being integrated into the overall politics of American society collectively and said, well, we can't do that to them because we can't do it to white folk. Because we do that to them and white folk, the white folk will rebel. even though they might accept it, but because there's the notion that Black people should address their political needs unitarily as a collective one, it facilitates the capacity to create a race management elite or a Black political class that we have today that the ruling class can use as a joystick to implement whatever kind of agenda they have on the corporate collective body of Black people without their democratic participation. So to your earlier point, my basic problem with cultural nationalism or any kind of Black nationalism, revolutionary or otherwise, is that all it does is render Black politics to collective politics of containment. I'll stop for now, and I'd like to hear if you want to interject, or maybe Jason wants to jump in.
No, I'm listening. Join the show.
I'm processing that because some of these thoughts are not new to me, but it's interesting to hear them stated this way. When I tend to think about this in terms of my experience of the leveraging of or the flattening out of Black politics as a way to incarcerate. That's in this context. That's probably mean.
Well,
but to lock Black people into one particular political paradigm, which is usually like part of the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party, to use racial solidarity as a means to block out policy problems that you see that emerge. And I watched this in southern cities over and over again, where you saw Black mayors who acted against the interests of their mostly Black constituency, but it was very hard for anyone to do anything about it because the notion of voting for someone against this Black mayor, you risk having a white mayor, and then boom.
And you're from Georgia.
Yeah.
You came up during Andrew. Was it Andrew? What's his name? The mayor. Andrew Young.
Andrew Young.
Was that Maynard Jackson or Andrew Young? Your time.
I think it was Andrew Young.
Andrew Young.
Yeah. I just saw it on a city level too. I mean, in Macon, we had issues with this over and over and over again, and then eventually there was a crack in that vote, but it didn't actually. What it ended up doing was consolidating the city in the county in ways that initially helped a lot of white flight neighborhoods, and then it did seem to work as a form of effective containment. Actually, because I just never thought about it that way. So one of the things that I see it doing, this came up in a conversation on education I had on Monday, where we were talking about affirmative action, unofficial quotas for racial admissions in elite colleges, right? If you look at the average income level, and income levels we're using a rough proxy to class. It's not the same as Marxist class analysis, but we'll just work with it for here. Usually the people, the POC, particularly the Black and Latino people at that school, were 8 to 12% richer than the average of the school. So meaning that they were pulling from a smaller section of Black people as a demographic group to meet that number and to build loyalty to the school and further donations, while looking to do something progressive about race. But for most people, they're not in that slice. They're not in that slice of Black people who's 8% richer to 12% richer than the rich end of white people. So you see this manifest a lot in race forward approaches to the subject, and it seems like a lot of the times what you get back is a lot of ADOS discussions.
I was going to say that same thing. That's kind of what ADOS, the Africans will not replace us is one of their chants. And I know I watched a little bit of that episode you had with, I believe it was Freddie DeBoer, where you guys were talking about you're getting these rich Africans from places like, was it Nigeria you mentioned? I don't remember.
It's Nigeria. It's usually the like the top 1 or 2% of fairly developed African countries. Nigeria, sometimes Kenya. But
bottom line, they're rich cats from these countries.
Very rich cats from these countries
that happen to be black that are getting into these universities.
But also, like, if you look at the non-immigrant, Freddie didn't feel comfortable talking about this, but I do know the stats. It's you're still pulling from basically generational black bourgeois that are finally able to get their kids into historically white institutions. So, and from a person who worked with kids, you know, from in Central Georgia, who had no access to that kind of money, no matter what, you know, they're not getting any benefit from that, like, at all. And the flattening out of black politics just erases that entirely. So, you know, from a quote outsider's perspective, unquote, that's what I saw, and that's why I started caring about this issue.
Did you have anything to say about that, Pascal?
Yeah, well, what you're basically saying is that the beneficiaries of the gains of the civil rights movement were the same class of black people who were leading the civil rights movement, which is exactly why the notion of having collective black community as work as a political faction is the problem, because it ends up having class-based remedies within the black community. And what you end up having is that the tier of the black community who will be the beneficiaries of those policies is the same tier of the black community that will be negotiating and the racial ventriloquists for the majority of black folk. A very good book, we've talked about this several times, we had him as a guest on our show, that highlights this, is Preston Smith's book, I think Racial Democracy in a Black Metropolis, I think is the title of the book. Jason, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Where Smith basically talks about in the post-war era that there was a division of ideology between racial democracy and social democracy. And what's really beautiful about the way in which Preston Smith discusses this in his book is that he gets beyond the normal trope that is a profound obstacle to discussing black political history, particularly in the 20th century, between the integrationists and the segregationists. Because usually, and Cruse does this as well, is that he divides the history of black thought in America between two types, the integrationists and the segregationists, which is actually a lie, which is actually factually incorrect, because they actually were materialists. They were black people who were actually radicals, who were not trying to integrate, but who were trying to have their politics rooted in political economy as well. So that, you know, he obscures a whole different levels of politics that exist in black communities also. So what Preston does to collapse this is that he analyzes the politics of black civic elites and even black nationalists in the post-war era, and he looks at their remedies as racial democracy or social democracy. In other words, whether they were pushing integration or they were pushing race first, race exclusion, or self-help, develop our own black businesses, so on and so forth, either way, all of their propositions did nothing but prop up a small tier of black folks who were lording over the supermajority of black people while they were getting rich or doing better or improving their lot, either through integration or self-exclusion, and that was the consequence of racial democracy, while social democracy, which was demanding for universal class-based agendas that would be rooted in the political economy and the material condition of black people who were the majority poor and working class, should be the way to address the needs of black folk. Since black folk are poor and working class, if we have more policies that are rooted in improving the lives of poor and working class people, wealth redistribution, unionization of jobs, federal job guarantees, so on and so forth, then we will improve the lot of the community, the portion of the community that is most in need of those programs. Largely because of Cold War exegesis and as well as strategic reasons, the social democracy platform was rejected. And largely what we got as the strategy, particularly when it came to housing or other things, was the racial democracy strategy. And the ultimate argument of the book is that the consequence of racial democracy as a strategy, which is what you're seeing now with all of this race first discourse that we've been seeing in the age of the Great Awakening, whether it's reparations or so on and so forth, is that all of these policies in the end will end up becoming wealth transfers to the Black political class and those who are class proximate to being their acolytes, beneficiaries, and dependents. And I agree with that analysis. History bears that analysis to actually be the case. And the reality of the fact is that part of the problem is that it becomes difficult to impossible to convince Black people of this reality because the intellectual thought leaders in the Black community, whether they are traditionally academics, media personalities, the Black chattering class, have a material benefit in pimping out Black suffering to get racial fatback and biscuits from the ruling class for being dedicated to one flank of the ruling class, whether it's the Democratic Party, liberal foundations, philanthropic institutions, tenure committees, so on and so forth. So there is a whole cottage industry of Black thought leaders, whether they're academics, whether they're media personalities, whether they are writers, who must push the Black grievance discourse into the consciousness of the country as much as possible, not because it changes things for poor and working class Black people, but because that no one would listen to them otherwise. And no one would care what they had to say. And there are right-wingers like that, and there are liberals like that. You know, there are different types of race pimps. There are liberal race pimps and conservative race. No one cares what Candace Owens has to say if she's not talking about Black people. No one cares what John Wickwater, who is a linguist, has no background in Black studies, has to say if he's not talking about Black people. No one cares what Glenn Lowry has to say if he's not talking about Black people, who is an economist. No academic background in race at all. No one cares what Al Sharpton has to say if he's not talking about Black people. No one cares what Ta-Nehisi Coates has to say if he's not talking about Black people.
I don't know. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a new Captain America series, so I disagree. So
the larger point I'm saying is that, you know, you have both factions of the ruling class have their chosen Negroes to suck blood off the Black poor and working class to keep their fatback and biscuits going without addressing the fact that what poor and working class Black people need, just like poor and working class white people, is policy that redistributes wealth and access to good, stable jobs and actual economic and socially stable social conditions to change their material reality and stop the proliferation of things like crime and social dislocation and family dislocation as well, which are all rooted in material, actual problems.
Mm-hmm. In some ways, it reminds me of the ways in which Zionism benefits off of anti-Semitism, and in some ways, I think even deliberately encouraging it, because the idea of a racial coherent collective actor means you have to sacrifice certain things to keep that collective actor moving, right? Like, I think about all the deals that are made, and I think about this in terms of Georgia, to keep Georgia more conservative in its legislature and both national and state levels, to also maintain Black districts. And most liberals will not touch that. They consider that a valid form of gerrymandering, even though it would actually help them in that state. The makeup of the House would be a lot more fair appointed if they were not worried about maintaining certain districts' racial cohesion. And this was broke out. I think ProPublica broke this out about 8 years ago, but like how much the Black Congressional Caucus have made deals with some of the most conservative elements of the GOP in the South in specific to keep Black representation up at the expense of larger policy that would help Black people. And this came out, I think, during the very end of the Obama administration, which I thought was apt. But this is not, and I don't even think this is unknown. Like most people understand this is happening, but they don't really have a coherent way to respond to it, because for pretty much most of society, when it comes to POC issues, racial democracy and is generally considered a valid approach. Unless you are the majority settler population, it's generally considered a valid approach.
It's a valid approach because it works for the ruling class.
Well, what was your take? What was your take, Varn? What was your take? What was it, 2018 in that election? Where was that the year Stacey Abrams ran for governor and ran into all that that bullshit with, I can't think of the guy's name who actually won. Kemp. Yeah, wasn't that year?
Yeah.
Would you say she's part of a Black? Because I don't really know Georgia politics all that well. Would you say she's part of that same Black political class?
Kinda.
Oh, of course, Stacey Abrams.
Yeah, she is trying to help enfranchisement. So it's a different her. If you're running for governor, your logic is actually going to be different than if you're running for like
mayor or something,
mayor or congressional district. But and so you want to be more inclusive. But I highly doubt she's doing anything to like change the voter districts in that state.
Because she got all that credit recently for flipping those congressional seats by getting out the quote unquote Black vote. And now a lot of those, they just passed that law in Georgia. That's going to make it harder.
Yeah. Although, the effect of the Black vote on that race is actually probably overstated. Democrats always win majority Black areas in Georgia. What was the shift is either more white men voting for a Democrat on the margin, and I mean not very many, but enough to throw an odds in the game in the suburbs of Macon and Atlanta, because that's specifically the areas that were new. And historically, some of those suburbs are sundown towns. Like, so that's like the other thesis I've heard put out is that you have a lot of well-off Asian immigrants into the suburbs of Atlanta that used to be majority right areas that threw it towards the Democrats. I don't know how to parse all that because we don't look at socioeconomic data to really parse what's going on there. And I also know that, like, in Georgia, there is a hard limit to the Black vote because of felon laws, and there's a hard limit to the poor white vote because of felon laws too. No one really talks about that, but it's there. And so I would just be surprised if Atlanta explains all of that, because Atlanta always votes Democratic. Now, again, it's hard to say what's actually going on there from my perspective, but it does seem like an area, and the South is an area where you see this, where you have urban areas that are dominated by Democrats, usually have mayors, Black mayors, almost entirely actually in the area. And yet there's very little change on the state legislative stage. Some of that has to do with like weirdnesses of felon laws. Like in Georgia, you can claim felon populations for your small county, even though they can't vote, to inflate your congressional representation on the state level. But some of that has to do with the way we draw the lines. And part of that is based off keeping a certain sector of black politicians who are kind of untouchable. Actually, like it's hard to run against them in power. And if you look at what that does for the average, poor person in Macon, and the average poor person in Macon is going to be black. It doesn't change their life at all. Positive. I mean, maybe negatively, but it doesn't help anything. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's just what I see as an outsider from the South.
Well, if you want a piece that I wrote for Black Agenda Report, and I've shared this with Jason before, it's called The Fallacy of Racial Kinship Politics. Mm-hmm. And it basically talks about why this kind of like race first politics ends up becoming, an empty vessel for black politics and black thought, because the charade is that you believe that this because this brother is my brother, you're going to look going, man. Black people, like any other people, work on their material and economic interests. And frankly, those things are going to govern them more than the notion of any kind of quote unquote racial allegiance when it comes to actual politics. And, in terms of, policy that's going to change the condition of black people, then I'm interested particularly in the politics, not just other kind of like, cultural, blather on and so on and so forth that, some people have, wrongly fetishized and focused on as a means to address the problem and try to separate the problem from being one rooted in political economy and politics or economy, or then others who are more reactionary, conservative, blood-sucking vampires who's like, see, if we had our own businesses, we'd be okay, everything be fine.
Well, don't you think that your point is made very, when you look at 84 in LA with Tom Bradley, mm-hmm. black mayor of an extremely large city. Around that same time, you have the black mayor, is it Jackson in Atlanta? Mm-hmm. You have a horrible crime problem in Los Angeles with a mayor that only wants to revitalize the downtown. And you really start to see a major crackdown in crime being ushered in by black talking heads that are saying, yes, longer sentences for drug dealers. And then you go to Atlanta and you have those child murders. So many young black kids get killed in the early 80s with the black mayor that's trying to keep it somewhat quiet because he wants to build this massive airport, which does become, a huge hub. And to your point about black politics being a politics of containment, what happened in Atlanta to those black families that lived in those projects where a lot of those murders happened? Those projects got torn down. Mm-hmm. What happened in LA with all those black kids? Where do they come from? Right?
Because black politics is a class politics that exists at the expense of poor and working class black people. Black politics is a class politics that exists at the expense of poor and working class black people, period.
And I think that politics starts to, it divorces the poor and working class from the political sphere altogether, because you're so tired of seeing not just white people, but people that look like you fucking you over.
Well, this gets to my book, right? Because what is particularly fascinating about this moment is that my book is about the kind of crisis of black politics, is that there's a younger generation of millennials who, most of them are college educated generally, who, because of the 2008 crash and the failures of the Obama presidency, are realizing that black politics does not work for black people, and they're trying to find solutions. Sadly, some of them are becoming kind of insular and reactionary. Even some of them are becoming turned on by the Trump administration. Not that I believe the Democrats are the answer, or they're returning to all kinds of, ridiculous, cartoonish, nationalist kind of like, self-help, lift up our bootstraps. Yeah, like the Italians and the Irish who are getting federally subsidized mortgages to buy houses in Levittown were lifting up their own bootstraps. But again, this is the kind of the cartoonish idiocy you get in terms of black political thought, because no one is willing to talk about how class is a major obstacle in Black America to having politics that helps the majority of Black people, because the majority of the educated Negro elites will be like, oh, you can't trust those white people. They're going to betray you. Them white leftists is going to betray you. We can't trust them, because they understand that their pockets are lined, acting like they care about Black folk, telling Black folk is like, we got to come together and have our own political party so I can suck more money out of your misery and get more dough for helping, the Democrats get elected. And, that kind of moronic imbecility is what keeps this circle jerk of, the charade of Black politics going over and over and over again. Why, again, continuously Black and poor and working class people are ground to dust until, like we had last year, they rebel. They burn down cities, they set things on fire, and then you have 500 wannabe tenured academics writing thought pieces and dissertations and papers, getting Ford Foundation money, trying to analyze, well, why did the Negro get so upset after George Floyd? Please tell us. So that creates a whole other circle jerk of imbecility that continues as well, But no one will say, well, maybe if we had a federal job guarantee that would be able to give guys a job paying them $40 an hour with union benefits, guarantee them, college education subsidized as well, and give them, discount rate, quality public housing, or even like totally interest-free mortgages for people who are of a certain economic tier, that might help across the board. And then you'll have some of these ADOS morons who will say, well, class programs don't work for Black folk. We got to have Black only policy. That's a racist policy. I like to see these Negroes tell their grandmothers who want Social Security and Medicare that class politics don't work for Black people. I like to see them tell their uncles who get VA hospital benefits that class politics don't work for Black people. I would like them to take their student loan benefits and take their college degrees and throw them in the garbage and say, you can take my college degree back because class politics don't work for Black people. But again, this is the kind of imbecility that circulates as Black thought when you have people who are racially looking at their navels, sniffing their own farts, thinking that their problems are idiosyncratic without realizing that their problems exist because they're poor and working class. And there are lots of poor and working class Black people, white people as well, who might join them to change these problems.
That brings up two things that I saw in the last year. One was there was a certain category that locally would be referred to as POC elders, which was kind of a funny idea, where this group of people was often blaming the militancy of local activists on white leftists, usually from out of town.
Yeah, that was something the Black political class was doing. They were saying it was like, these Antifa are telling all folk to burn things down, and they stop. They're playing into the reactionary right narrative as if Black people at various times in history didn't burn things out before there was even a thing called Antifa. But again, that's all posturing and posing, because the ultimate fear of the Black political class and all of these racial spokesmen and all of these petit bourgeois PMC Negroes whose quality of life was made because of the suffering of poor and working class Black people. The worst thing that could happen to these Negroes is for poor and working class Black people and poor and working class white people to say, you know what, screw them all. Let's create a politics based on our material condition and shut down all these racial ventriloquists and look at all of them as class enemies, Black, white, or otherwise. That's why you had certain figures throughout history in the populist era, whether it be Booker T. Washington, throughout history, whether it be Black nationalists, who always tried to neutralize Black folk and white folk, and the state is always behind this. This is why the Southern Bourbon class of capitalists finance Booker T will always work to prop up some Negroes or some white people to neutralize cross-racial alliance between poor and working class Blacks and whites to challenge capital and power in this country. It happened with the Black communists and the socialists in the 30s and 40s. It happened with McCarthyism. It happened during the populist era. It happens all the time. And a perfect example of that is why it was primary ruling class agenda number one, to have charlatans like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Joyanne Reed try to convince Black people that socialism or social democracy or Bernie Sanders politics is a white thing, when we have an over 100 some odd year history of Black people fighting for socialism or fighting for material anti-capitalist politics to change the condition of Black people in this country. And that's why a complete fatback and biscuits eating politician like James Clyburn can get on television and say, I ain't never seen no Black socialist, while there's a statue of W.E. Du Bois sitting right behind him.
Well, you know, I always akin labor struggles, especially nowadays, because a lot of people, let's just be honest, the people watching this show maybe have a history of labor struggles throughout this country in the last couple centuries, but the average person doesn't really understand labor struggles. Mm-hmm. So they understand labor struggles usually through the lens of sports. Oh, look, this team's striking. Why is this player striking? And when the NBA last year was striking, that was huge news, even on the left, because now you're having a labor discussion, a real deal labor discussion in mainstream media. And who crushes it? Who comes in to stop the strike? Barack Obama. And
Barack Obama
crushes the strike. So to your point about neutralizing movements, I mean, you had a real moment where a lot of these players coming off the heels of the George Floyd uprisings were really starting to get involved in left politics. Speaking of left politics,
Phoenix.
Hi.
Phoenix, you gotta say hello.
Hey, Phoenix.
Okay, you gotta go.
But the larger project and problem we have on the left, and this is one of the kind of our agendas, our not even a pet peeve, our major critique is a lot of people is like, wow, these guys criticize Black folk a lot, this messed up. It's like, no, we criticize the problem a lot. But part of the major problem is that the white left has absolutely no ability, capacity, interest in diagnosing how class is an obstacle to radical Black politics that channels the materialism, and has demonstrated no interest in penetrating the fault lines of Black politics to address poor and working class Black people where they are, to try to create the coalitions necessary to slay this dragon of horrendous neoliberal politics. That's a massive problem. These people are not living up to the reputation of at least the white left that we had in the 30s and in the populist era at all, because they're too busy, you know, getting their IBM trust fund daddy's money, living in their, brownstone in Brooklyn, gentrifying neighborhoods and putting on hammer and sickle t-shirts.
When I think of the white left, I tend to think of three places, which is Brooklyn, particularly around Greenpoint, Berkeley, particularly not Oakland, and Portland, which is the whitest major metropolitan area in the country.
Portland is the whitest city I've ever been to in my life, and I've been to Europe.
And I've also been to Europe. I mean,
like you think you've seen white shit till you've been to Portland. Portland's where white on white crime is a real thing.
It's a real thing in a lot of places.
Yeah, I was about to say.
They actually report on it in Portland. I almost got a smile out of him.
I always say that Oakland is where white people. I mean, not Oakland. Although it might be soon. Oregon is where white people go to retire, and whether or not you're left delusional or right delusional is whether you're urban or rural. But
I call Portland Atlanta for white people.
Okay. We've shit on Portland enough. But I mean, but there is a like, when I think about where the white left isn't where a lot of working class white people are either. I mean, like yes, most of them are in some vague notion on the upper strata of the working class, but like they're not where I grew up. Like they're not in Macon, they're not in rural Wyoming. they're not in places where frankly white people and black people interact a lot, and actually are exposed to each other
because they're scared of certain places. Much like, look, I always say on This Is Revolution, we sacrifice no space, right? We're in all spaces. That's nerd shit, music, church, religion. I'm not afraid of it. And living with a white family for as many years as I did, that was extremely Christian. One thing that I noticed is that right-wing politics are embedded in there. And it's not a religious thing, because I've also been around white Christians that are very far to the left, right? White Christian socialists are a real thing. They fucking exist. And it's all, we brought up this topic to a leftist, an alabaster leftist, as Pascal calls them, and says, do you do any recruitment in the black church? And it was a lot of hims and ha's and uhs and and a lot of excuses on why they weren't going to go into the black church. And it's like, the shit's not like a horror movie. You can go into the place. It's not a Tyler Perry movie, but this is where people like Clyburn have a shit ton of power. This is where black politics really has a lot of power. So those wheels get greased in the black church. Still.
When Obama came to Macon, he went to the churches. He didn't go anywhere else.
Where else would he have to go? The barbershops? Like, let's just be serious here. And as long as cats are afraid to go into these spaces for whatever reason, I'm an atheist. Okay, that's great. But if you have something important to say, there's motherfuckers that want to hear it. You don't got to walk in there, you know, amening and shouting in church just to get people to listen to you. That's silly. But why are you scared of fucking white guys that talk like Archie Bunker? I don't know. I'm asking a question. Why are cats afraid to go into those spaces? You brought it up, Varn.
Yeah, well, you know, there's a theory about that I think I pretty much buy, that a lot of the fear that white leftists have is like this underlying class shame, that they could be one of those shit kickers. They grew up, you know. Well, actually, a lot of them grew up. Right?
I don't believe that. It's not class shame. It's class lack of familiarity, because a lot of the white left are put up, you know, what they call PMC, or petit bourgeois, university second generation, university foundation kids, or academic adjacent. You know, or, you know, not all of them, but a lot. There's a faction of them that are from that particular class demographic. You know, whether they're in the organizations like DSA, so on and so forth. And just because they may be downwardly mobile in this particular era of precarity in the position where we are in terms of capitalism today, but you know, they don't want to go in those spaces because they have no class familiarity with those people. Or racial.
I mean, you from Derick, you from the South. We've had a long discussion about South hood shit. I feel confident saying I don't think you're afraid to walk into a white church.
I'm not afraid to walk into a white church or a black church. I mean,
you're in Utah now. I'm get a little shook at them.
I would be. Well, I might be a little bit more afraid here, but that's because like
a little different. That's a whole different story. But like real talk, that's where you got people meeting that want to listen to some sort of message, and then cats just don't want to talk to them. I've never understood that.
But I mean, a lot of these people couldn't go to a non-professional union hall either. Like I mean, like if I asked, like, yeah, they could go speak to the teachers union. They could speak to people like me. But like, if they wanted to go speak to my dad's union when he was in a union, and you deal with a bunch of mechanics, are my brothers like roadies guild, and you're dealing with a bunch of frankly drugged out roadie people. They don't know how to handle that. And you're right. They're partly afraid of the class faux pas, and it's also partly some of it. I will say that you do have a phenomenon with millennials where a lot of them are of this educated class for the first generation, and they're hiding their roots. There's a lot of that. But I will also say that the most class anger I've ever had at somebody who isn't truly bourgeois has been at leftists in New York. Like the first time I went to a leftist meeting in New York City, it was actually, I was 30. And it was right after Occupy got discount for the winter, and I was going to check it out. And I was actually in Brooklyn, and I had someone class shame me for not, some fucking anarchist, but class shame me for not speaking perfect Mandarin because I didn't have an Ivy League education, and I went to Asia and learned the languages just by hanging out with people. And and it was bizarre because there was just no acknowledgement that, like, you're talking about like my income and background as much as you're talking about how intelligent I am. Like,
wow.
So yeah, I mean, you're right about that. But there's also like there's this cultural stigma of like dealing with anything that's explicitly working class for fear. Often it's portrayed as fear of being racist, but what I find hilarious about this, right? I used to teach at a like public private partnership charter school here in Salt Lake. I got out of that now. I'm a regular public school teacher, but I had a bunch of, they all hired all these fairly credentialed liberal people. I live on the west side of Salt Lake. It's not black because, well, there aren't a lot of black people here, period, unless you're Somali or Ethiopian. There are a few, but there's not a lot. And but I live on, my neighborhood is predominantly Latino and Polynesian. And these well-intentioned white people would not come to my house because it was dangerous. I live in fucking Salt Lake City. There's not a dangerous neighborhood in this town. It's working class and it's of color. I don't know which one bothers them more, but it bothers them. They associate that with dangerousness, even though statistically speaking, actually, you're safer here. This neighborhood has less crime in it than because anyone is going to steal shit's going to go to the better neighborhood across town anyway. And hardly anyone ever gets shot here. So like, it's a very weird thing to see. And yet these were people who were like doing all the woke lessons, who would have proudly called themselves SJWs. A lot of them were like me. They were of
social justice warriors, for those who don't know.
Yeah. And a lot of them were like me. They're white of the slightly off-white variety, like not WAF ethnics, but we're white now. But the amount of like the difference between what was spoken and what was actually enacted, yeah, I mean, it's what conservatives pick on too. They were able to use this for action purposes because they're just like, yeah, you don't mean it. Like, you won't go live in those neighborhoods and whatever. But it's a very weird thing to watch because it's at one time like an obvious stereotype, and another way, it's completely fucking true. But it's not, a lot of people would say it's like a fear of, it's just racism. I don't even think that. I think it's literally a fear of like, of different class cultures and not knowing how to move between them.
I think it's a little bit of all of it.
I think it's class and a race, because these are the same alabaster leftists who love to flex hard on their Afro-socialist POC in meetings and talking about like, I've read Du Bois 5 times. You don't know what you're talking about. But they want, they're not going to come into East New York or certain parts of East New York or certain parts of, well, they go to East New York now because it's gentrified, but they ain't going to Brownsville. Brownsville is still Brownsville. I mean, guarantee you that.
Leaving West Oakland recently, I was there for a big shift in that community. West Oakland historically was like the last spot on the Great Migration west for Black people. It literally was a train station there, right? And historically was a bit of a Black neighborhood, not a lot of Black home ownership, but a Black neighborhood nonetheless. And not anymore. And a lot of those people were living in their car across the street from me in the warehouse that I was living in legally as well. And it was interesting to see the shift and how people navigated the shift, because also what was interesting about West Oakland was you had these projects, or what we call projects in California, which don't look like what Pascal's used to growing up in New York. It's like a series of apartment complexes. And literally across the street, which actually at one time was a freeway before the earthquake, now it's a street, are very expensive rebuilds of Victorians, because the houses there in West Oakland were these gorgeous Victorians. And a lot of these rebuilds are going for sometimes 7 figures. It's Bay Area, right? And someone had spray painted on one of them, "I hella love gentrification." On a brand new construction, the paint was fresh, and I walked by and saw it, and I was like, my first thought was, I don't think it's someone that actually traditionally lives in this neighborhood, because there were certain aspects of the gentrification that they appreciated. Keep in mind, it's not affecting where you live when you live in government housing, as far as your rents. The one thing that we got was a few places to eat for a minute. And it was interesting to see how the people from the neighborhood were navigating this huge, it was like all of a sudden, because San Francisco just shoved everybody to West Oakland. It's literally the other side of the bridge.
Yeah.
And there were people in the community that really didn't mind it. They were like, "Oh, this is more people in the community, whatever. Oh, now we got some different shit in the grocery store. Okay. But the problems start to happen when all these places that people were used to going to now are no longer there. The corner stores got to close. A few places you got to eat that were cheap are gone, and they're getting replaced with higher end co-ops. We don't need an artisanal vegan cupcakery, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting to watch that whole, for me to watch it go down at once, because I think when people talk about places like, Williamsburg, it's always I've never heard a person from New York, especially a Black person from New York, say anything positive about Williamsburg. And living in West Oakland, it was interesting to hear both sides of a conversation about what was happening, because also too, West Oakland was historically a place where artists lived, because there's so many fucking warehouses. Sadly, it's where the ghost ship fire was, where unfortunately people lost their lives. But bigger than that, it's like you could do shit down there. Go ahead, Pascal.
I was about to say that I think we've had a very good conversation, but because I believe that when we do these too long, a little over an hour, it dissuades people from listening. I don't want us to take it. No, I'm serious, because I've been talking to a lot of people who like our content, and they were like, "It's great," but whenever it gets over an hour, people are like, "This is too intense for more than an hour." I can't take it over that. So this content was so important and good, and this conversation was so important. I don't want us to make it, prohibitive to viewership. This is your show, Varn, so you make the call.
We'll start to wrap up. Gentrification is actually one of these issues that gets talked about in racial terms, like all the time, because there's no way not to. But I am thinking about a lot about how that's a damned if you do, damned if you don't for poor communities. Because what you're describing, eventually all the corner stores move. There's no place cheap to eat. But like, I left a community that could not for the life of itself get gentrified, and it just died. Like, even the poor people eventually left because there was nothing there over time. There was no money to sustain anything. Like, an entire half of Macon is basically shuttered. And like, when I think about the way this is portrayed by a lot of politicians, particularly a lot of Democratic politicians, particularly a lot of Democratic politicians of color, it's portrayed in this way that seems to think that if you just kept the money out and thus the white people out, these neighborhoods would sustain themselves. and you're like, with what exactly, other than like a captive vote for someone? Like, what's gonna under this economic system, what's going to keep this neighborhood above water?
Mm-hmm.
And that's been something that I've really thought about. I mean, because neighborhoods that I lived in Macon got the violent crime got so bad, and I think people don't realize this about the South, but some of the most violent cities in America are not even the big cities in the South; they're the mid-sized cities in the South. They just don't get the headlines because like they're not big in absolute numbers, but if you look at per capita. But like the NAACP was calling for like curfews in the black neighborhoods where I was at because the shootings were getting so high. And it was just absurd. I was like, well, why can't you just, I don't know, invest in this community? Because I guarantee you people don't really like shooting each other. Generally speaking, I've been around the world. They don't actually really enjoy it. So like, and then some of what I got back was gentrification concerns. We'll lose the quote ethnic character of this neighborhood. And I'm a white guy. What do I know? But like, I was just aghast because I'm like, well, but like this, no one's going to stay here if it stays this shitty. Also, why are you inviting police into this neighborhood? It doesn't help anybody. Like, and that was like the conundrum that and the experience of teaching in a public school in the South really started making me think about like all this like weird both post-racial narrative that you heard from like from some of the Obama white stands, and then this like Tim Wise, and I'm thinking about that from the Obama years, right? He's kind of gone away now. That response, none of it spoke to any of that, like at all. None spoke to any of it whatsoever.
Pascal, do you know Tim Wise?
I don't know him personally. I've interacted with him on social media. I don't find his contributions particularly important or effective at all. Tim Wise is going to tell you blame Whitey, blame Whitey, blame Whitey. I can talk to black people and hear that. Tim Wise is not telling me anything that I don't hear from black people 24 hours a day, that the white man, without any conversation about how, there's not a single policy harm, whether it's gentrification, mass incarceration, that exists in urban areas that could happen without the participation of the black political class. There are necessary functionaries in all of that.
I just want to say, Erica, you're right.
Tim Wise can't talk.
Someone say Erica's right. The ghost ship was in the east. I just want to say she's right. Shout out. So Tim Wise, so you're in a room right now, Pascal. Picture a room. It's a beautiful room. There's a little waterfall in the middle of the room, and it's gorgeous. And all you hear is the sounds of beautiful island music that you love. And Tim Wise is sitting down next to Robin DiAngelo. And then Ibrahim X. Kendi walks in. What's the first thing you do?
You're just trying to raise his blood pressure?
What's the first thing you do, Pascal?
I turn around and look for the juice bar, man.
And that might be the note we end on, actually. So Pascal, where can we find more of your writings on this topic? Let's enough of that.
blackagendareport.com. I have writings in Huffington Post. We're doing more writing. We've been working on we didn't even promote our show. This is Revolution podcast. You can find on all your podcast platforms. You can go to YouTube. You can check out our Facebook page. This is Revolution Podcast. Our YouTube page. This is Revolution Podcast. All your podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Podcaster, Spotify, all of them. This is Revolution Podcast. We stream live Tuesday nights, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Thursday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and Saturdays at noon Eastern Standard Time, 3 days a week. I am working on a book on the crisis of Black politics from Obama to Trump. Jason Myles is working on our technical and production, doing audios and videos, talking about some of the subjects we discuss on politics. This is Revolution has been in existence for a little over a year. Jason and I will be coming up on 6 months working together this June, and we've seen a nice increase, but we're still new and developing and growing, and we'd like to see our audience grow. Please like and subscribe to our page on YouTube, share amongst your friends, and come check us out. We talk about politics from a left perspective. That is a Black left perspective, but is not limited to certain sectarian traditions that do not talk about the importance of working with a cross-racial alliance to try to change capitalism, because we realize that 14% of the population is not going to be able to spark the revolution to change everything, even if we did want to mow all the class enemies. So we're going to need a few other people who will help us mow the class enemies together. So that's why we try to expand left politics. I'm being facetious. We don't want to mama anyone today. Not today.
Not
but
today.
The larger position
only.
is that we will. Yeah, for patron, only the patrons can do it. We realize that we want to. Laugh track. She put out a laugh track. Can you believe that? But we're trying to expand left discourse for us to get a public goods governance of policy that's interested in redistributing wealth and policy to poor and working class people, Black, brown, white, and otherwise, and change this narrative of neoliberal capitalism rooted in privatization that we've had for 50 years, and fight the reactionary right as well. And we know that the centrist Democrats are not up to that job. So please join us.
Yeah, I will endorse you guys too. You're one of the only left podcasts I listen to. I believe as many of them as I appear on, and as much as I make them. I actually can't stand them because I normally know what they're gonna say. I actually don't know what you guys are gonna say on any given thing, so I tune in. I particularly recommend Foreign Policy Thursdays. If you only have one time to go in a week and maybe ask some questions, that's a good one because I find those particularly illuminating, and that is something very under discussed on the left right now, weirdly, actually.
You're coming on to Foreign Policy Thursday.
Yeah, to talk on about Thursdays, we do what we call Foreign Policy Thursdays. Come check us out.
So, to that point of Varn coming on the show on Thursday, when you hear stuff like this, it's because I have a new board, and this board means that we can take phone calls. So,
wow,
is Varn ready? Are you guys ready to call in? I just got to set the phone up and everything.
I thought this was only for patrons.
It's only going to be, well, yeah, we're going to be patrons. Yeah, I'm not prepared. I don't have it in me. There's too much hood in me to deal with the phone for people I don't know. For patrons only, Varn's going to be taking your calls. I just want you to know that. We'll be ready. We'll be up. The battle station will be operational.
All right. And with that, anything else we need to plug?
Nah, man, that's it.
We're going to do another nerd night. Did you want to come on?
When?
Probably next Friday.
I might be able to. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. And I'm going to close this out.